Hi, good afternoon. My name is Josh Kwan, and I'm so glad to introduce you to our webcast for today. I'm the president of The Gathering, and The Gathering is a community of givers who are motivated and compelled and united by our Christian faith to give well and to steward wisely the resources that God has entrusted to our care. We meet once a year in an annual conference. We organize trips for small groups of people to explore and get to know one another. We pursue friendship and we pursue learning and trusted relationships. And one of the things that we do is we host these webinars and webcasts, a chance to learn from experts in their fields. And this is something that has become one of the favorites among our audience, among our community. This conversation, which we've informally titled, What in the World is Happening? We do this once a year with a selection of political journalists, pundits, public thinkers, and they help us understand what's happening in this world and give us an interpretation of what's going on. And so today's event is co-hosted by Josh Good, the director of the Faith Angle Forum. We're so pleased to have him as part of our, as moderating this conversation. You'll be pleased to get to know him pretty soon. We pulled together, Josh and I have pulled together an outstanding group of journalists and opinion writers, voices who are well versed and steeped in what's happening in Washington and around the world. And we're excited about having their range of perspectives and not just representing one side, but to have a view that encompasses left and right and center. What I'd like to do now is just give you a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll introduce our bridge, Phoebe Miles, in just a moment. But first, here's our housekeeping. Hopefully everyone here has installed the latest version of Zoom, which will allow you to view the speakers as we spotlight them before we move into a Q&A for everyone in gallery view, okay? Now, if you have not downloaded the latest version, we recommend that you select speaker view for the first portion of the session and then gallery view when we move to Q&A. We will have a time of Q&A with the audience, that's all of you. After hearing first short perspectives from each of our panelists, and then a dialogue, a guided conversation that Josh Good will host with our panelists. And at that point, we invite you to turn on your video and share your question once we call upon you, okay? So what we're gonna do is invite you to send your questions at any point during the session to The Gathering in the chat box. So in the bottom of your screen, you should see a little quotation bubble. Click on that and then select The Gathering and submit your questions there. During the Q&A, we'll call on you to ask your question live, unless you'd actually rather remain anonymous and off video, in which case, please let us know that when you submit your question. Finally, we would love to see your faces during the Q&A. This is a community. You all know each other, hopefully, or most of each other. And so if you're willing, turn on your video and be able to see one another during that portion of the session. Now I'd like to turn things over to Phoebe Miles. Phoebe is a longtime friend of The Gathering, and she's also been really involved in the Faith Angle Forum. I thought she'd be a wonderful perspective to be able to talk a little bit about what she thinks of the Faith Angle Forum, why she believes in it. So Phoebe, welcome.
Much for the introduction, and I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to talk to all you today about two of my favorite organizations, The Gathering and the Faith Angle Forum. So like many of you, I first heard about the Faith Angle Forum at The Gathering. It was 2009, and the meeting was in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'd heard a presentation by Michael Cromartie, the founder of Faith Angle, but I didn't actually have the chance to talk with him in person. It turns out he's very popular and there's a crowd of people in front of him. But on the flight back home, we both were flying to DC. I saw him at the airport and I decided to go up and introduce myself, and I gave him my card. We had a brief conversation, that was it. But if you remember, this was 2009, is 1.5 years into the Great Recession. Unbeknownst to me, the Faith Angle's largest supporter, Pew Foundation, had pulled out, and Michael was going to have to cancel the forum that he had planned for November. So one of his friends suggested to him that he reach out to me at the Gloria Dei Foundation, but as Michael was talking to him on the phone, he saw that he had placed my card right next to the computer several days before. No need for an introduction, he said. I have a card right here. So we met for lunch that week, our foundation, Gloria Day, agreed to stand in the gap. And we gave an emergency grant and attended our very first forum on 12th of November, 2009. What is today? The 12th of November, 11 years ago today, we got to stand in the gap. And it was one of the best decisions we have ever made. As Christians, I think we all often feel as if we're misunderstood by the media, but I truly believe this is because there are so few opportunities to engage in meaningful and civil conversations with people that we perceive to be hostile to us. Now, with increased polarization, this trend is even more pronounced. So now, more than ever, I believe it's time that we as Christians should seek to encourage encounters that increase authentic relationships and understanding. In my opinion, the Faith Angle Forum is one of the most transformational and efficient of all of the ministries. Just think about it, the most elite journalist in the world, and we're not talking huge conferences, we're talking a small get-together, get to participate in academic forums with the top scholars on matters of faith and religion. They get to ask in-depth questions, no sound bites. They also get to engage in meaningful conversations with the top faith leaders of today, like Tim Keller and Rick Warren. You know, it's really hard to perceive as an enemy someone that you have broken bread with together. And remember, it's the writers and journalists that shape readers' perspectives of topics. And the better educated they are, and the more honest and accurate the coverage will be. So even if they still disagree, after a conversation with a leading thinker, the journalists will have increased respect and understanding. So we were really sad, of course, like all of us, when Michael Carmody passed away in 2017, and we worried about the future of the Faith Angle Forum. But I am so thrilled that we have Josh Good. Not only has he continued with the very best of the legacy, but he's expanded it to respond to the needs of and the challenges of this generation. In addition to the regular forums that I was familiar with, he has introduced things like the annual Carmody Forum for a younger journalist, a European Faith Angle Forum, twice a month podcast, annual seminars with leading thinkers. It's really such an incredible opportunity for all of you. I encourage you to take part in some of the podcasts. Even one of our journalists today took part in one of the very first one, Christine Imba, and I think you'll really find these outstanding. So with that, that's kind of my little pitch. I love what the Faith Angle Forum is doing, and I love the gathering, and I just want to turn this back over to Josh Good, and he'll take it from here.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, for standing in the gap 11 years ago, and you've given us a lot to live up to today. So we'll see if we can do just that. We have three outstanding journalists who, as Josh Kwan said, come at their work from maybe slightly different, political, civil perspectives, but have an awful lot of common ground and a lot of wisdom in what they're doing. And so I want to introduce each of them one by one to just give a 2-minute take on the reality of what happened last week and a sort of a window into how they think that forecasts what is ahead. So we'll start with Tim, then Christine, and then Ben Domenech. So get right into it. And of course, one quick thing for sort of framing all this, David Brooks, who is on our advisory board and a friend of Phoebe and her husband Richard's, says in his column last week, if there was going to be one Democratic blowout election, this was it, but it failed. America's narrative is perpetually surprised by events. The voters reminded us yet again that the other side is not going away, and we have to live with each other. So part of that is to hear from Tim first, and then the other part, like David also says sometimes at the gathering, is that you didn't come here to hear the experts speak. You came to hear yourselves speak, or something like that. And so we want to get time for all of that. First up today is Tim Carney from the Washington Examiner and from the American Enterprise Institute, where he's a resident fellow. He wrote a wonderful book about 2 years ago called Alien in America, a year and a half ago, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. He's also written 2 others, The Big Ripoff and Obamonomics. Just like Ben and Christine, he's written in far too many outlets to list them all. But one relevant detail you may not know is that he and his wife, Katie, have 6 kids, practice their Catholic faith seriously. They're the real deal. And you'll find that out if you read the harrowing story in his latest book, Alienated America. Tim, what did American voters tell us last week?
Well, thank you, Josh. Largely what we learned was about three candidates, right? Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and Hillary Clinton. 4 years ago, we had the two least popular politicians in America running against one another. And Donald Trump was able to pull off wins in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan for two reasons. One, he turned out a unusual number of white working class voters, what 4 years before Sean Trend had called the missing white vote. And he swung a lot of those working class white voters from either Democrats or independents over to voting for him on the Republican line. And the other factor 4 years ago was that Hillary Clinton was also uniquely off-putting, and you had very important Democratic blocs vote at much lower rates than normal, primarily African Americans and to some extent sort of the left, the liberal ideological base. This time around, you had Joe Biden, much less offensive to all sorts of populations than Hillary Clinton, but also Donald Trump actually being the president for 4 years motivated the left's base. So you had higher African-American turnout, and there's a good case to be made that that made the difference, at least in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and down in Georgia. The other thing, though, the swing population that you had was the upper middle class white suburbia, that this population had been drifting away from Republicans for years. Donald Trump accelerated that a little in 2016 and then even more so in 2020. I think that's a demographic explanation. But finally, a quick note, though, on what I wrote about in Alienated America. I had sort of three populations I talked about: that upper middle class white bread suburbia, and then you've got these really interesting, strong religious communities I wrote about, such as Salt Lake City or Oostburg, Wisconsin, where everybody's Dutch and goes to church twice on Sundays. Those are the places that don't suffer from alienation. These were the places where Donald Trump actually underperformed in both of them. If you look on the map, if you look at the the counties with the highest religious attendance, you saw Trump underperformed in 2016 and then even more so in 2020. But if you look for the places with the most suffering, the most alienation, that's where you see Trump did well in 2016 and then found even more votes in 2020.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim, very much. So let's turn next to Christine Emba, who is a columnist at the Washington Post. She writes for the opinions section there on ideas in society. Before coming to the Post, Christine was the Hilton Kramer Fellow in Criticism at the New Criterion and a deputy editor for The Economist's Intelligence Unit. She's got an AB in Public and International Affairs from Princeton. She's working on a book entitled Rethinking Sex from Penguin Press that's due out this fall. And it's an attempt essentially to critique and understand our prevailing sexual ethic in a post-Me Too world. She was at the gathering in person with a number of you in Dallas last year alongside Mike Gerson and others. And so you may remember her from there. Christine, what's your 2-minute take on the election? Oh, and you're still on mute. Yeah, perfect.
Always the mute button on these Zooms. So I would say that I'm going to give you my personal interpretation, how I felt about this election. But my reaction was one of relief mingled with actual disappointment. I mean, Donald Trump's term so far has made the nation's divides and failings extremely obvious, and in many cases has actually inflamed them. From the beginning, he's purposefully exploited racial tensions. He's spread falsehoods purposefully and constantly, leading to a severe breakdown in trust, civility, and an understanding of the common good of the United States. He has frankly truly ruined the witness of evangelicals in particular who followed him, and his neglect of governing, as made most clear during the recent pandemic, has had disastrous results. I feel like I have experienced many of these things rather acutely. I am young, I am a Black woman in America, I'm the daughter of immigrants. And I'll say that I did feel relief when the results began to come in and made it clear that Trump had lost the election. That said, as Josh said, quoting David Brooks, I, like many people, had hoped that this election would be a repudiation of these things that Donald Trump stood for, and it wasn't. Young people, minorities, those who really felt under threat during this administration, they did come out to vote, helping make turnout the highest it's been in a century. But one of the alarming and worrying things to me about this election was that a lot of people still did, in fact, vote for Donald Trump. It seemed to signal that many Americans did look around at this and say, this is fine, actually. I want more of this. Racial strife, that's fine. An unmanaged, rampaging pandemic, that's okay. I will stand for this because I just want to stand for this person. I think actually in some ways that might actually be, if not beneficial, at least beneficially eye-opening for those who thought the election would swing easily either way. Because now we know that there are huge and deep fissures in opinion in this country, and we will actually have to unify, come to meet the other side, and begin to understand where these changes and differences lie if we want to move forward. The challenge of the Biden administration will be to bring both sides of the country into the fold and to actually address these areas of difference. And the challenge for conservatives and the right will actually simply be not to obstruct him.
Terrific. Thank you, Christine. And let's turn next to Ben Domenech, who is the co-founder of The Federalist and the author of the daily Transom that goes out Mondays through Fridays. Ben is someone that most of us learn from every time we're together. He's published more or less everywhere, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Politico, Commentary, GQ, and he has appeared somewhat regularly on Fox News, on MSNBC, on CNN, on Face the Nation, CBS. Ben is also on the personal front, married to Meghan McCain, the daughter of the late senator. This afternoon, listen, we're joined by half of DC's newest power couple, in Ben, who always is taking a few moves ahead.
God help us.
All right, so if you've not been reading the Transom, Ben, what should we take away from last week's election?
Chesterton said politicians are the pestilence of modern times. That's what you should take away. I'm just going to run through a few things that stick out to me, but I think that the most interesting element of this election is, we heard a lot about in 2016, the forgotten man. I think that what we have this time around is maybe the forgotten men and women, or the unpollable men and women who exist across this country, who really ended up making the difference in the kind of outcome that we're dealing with today, which surprises so many people. There's a really interesting cultural dynamic going on where we see certain pockets of traditionally Republican communities in recent decades shifting into the Democratic coalition. And we see certain pockets of communities that had traditionally been quite Democrat for quite a lot of reasons, shifting into perhaps the Republican and the Trump coalition. And I think it's really interesting to see. And again, we have the early data on this. It was still, waiting on the finals, that across the country, of the 200 plus counties that flipped from voting for Barack Obama to voting for Donald Trump, Joe Biden won the presidency, winning back only 19 of them. And those counties were, to Tim's point, primarily these suburbanite, heavily white counties that made the difference in the 3 states that really could have shifted this election. It looks like at the end of the day, Donald Trump famously won the 3 states by less than 100,000 votes to win the presidency. It looks like this time around he's going to lose 3 states by less than 100,000 votes in order to lose the presidency. So again, a very close election, and one where his coalition ended up coming out in a surprising way. Emily Ekins, who's a libertarian Mormon researcher who's at the Cato Institute, now used to be at Reason Foundation, has, I think, the most important piece of research about this that we can look back on, which showed that over 60% of Americans are unwilling or are worried about sharing their honest views. I've seen behind the scenes polling that was conducted for both by Republican pollsters and by others, just sort of nonpartisan, interested in this question. One of the most interesting aspects of this was a question that I saw, which said, asked people, do you know someone in your community or neighborhood who you believe supports President Trump or Republicans, but would be unwilling to make that known? And a significant number of Americans said yes. Their follow-up question was, does that describe you? And it turns out, much to the chagrin of a lot of the people who analyze the poll data, even down to the granular district level, that describes a lot of Americans across the country. One of the most critical aspects of this, I think, is that Republicans have traded a lot of upper class suburban white support for a lot of working class and more diverse support that they've frankly been chasing for decades among not just Asian and Latino immigrant communities that we saw shift elections across Florida, saw the make a huge difference in Texas. But to see a situation where, a Trump-led Republican Party is prevailing the way they are in the Rio Grande Valley, to see them, win competitive seats like Congressman Will Hurd's by more than they were with him as a candidate, this is a significant and interesting outcome that I think we're going to be digging into for a long time. And we are hampered by a number of factors, particularly that is as wrong as the polls were, I think, going into this election. We can't really assess the exit polls as being perhaps as accurate as we'd like them to be. We're going to have to do a lot of follow-up work on this, and a big barrier to it is going to be the unwillingness of people to say what they really believe, a shift that has happened that pollsters, political analysts, and professors are going to be dealing with, I think, for a lot of time going forward, and having to find ways to get around. Eric Kaufman, who obviously wrote White Shift, and I know is familiar probably to a lot of you, has an excellent piece at Unheard that looked at some of the initial factors here. And I think that that's just the beginning of the kind of research that we're going to have to do into an election that surprised so many people. And, frankly, on the cultural and religious side of things, a situation where white evangelicals in the suburbs are lost to the Republican Party, at least for this election and potentially going forward, and are replaced by Catholic, more working class Latino communities, that's going to have an enormous impact on the way that parties approach cultural issues and faith-related issues.
Awesome. Let's get into it. That's really helpful, Ben. So maybe with what you just shared with Christina's hopes in terms of possible forecasts that went differently, and what Tim said, let's talk first a little bit about why. Why did pollsters misjudge it so much? There was that memorable tweet by Tim's old colleague Henry Olsen in the middle of the night, 10 o'clock or so, where he said, gosh, basically, as pollsters, we're going to have to reckon with this. I never like being wrong professionally, he said, but it's clear Biden won't win the national vote by more or less every major polls crosstabs implied. That's a polling error of mammoth proportions, and the industry will have a lot of serious reckoning, a lot of serious thinking to do. So how do you see what Ben just talked about, the sort of silent voter, and particularly with the sort of hat tip to some of the socially conservative issues, freedom of conscience, religious liberty, the abortion policy, and moral concerns even over character and temperament. How do you see those playing into this cycle with respect to those who maybe voted the other way this time?
I'll start, Josh. I think that Ben's analysis was correct, and that poll that Emily Eakins, what was it, the Democracy Fund, is that the name of the group? What they did really tells you that a lot of people are afraid to speak their minds. But this is really interesting, right? Where do these people live? Like I have a brother who lives in Park Slope and is like a Trump supporter. So I understand why he's like hiding his views, right? But a lot of this is people who live in rural Wisconsin who are hiding their views. It wasn't primarily like, the person whose neighbors all have the Black Lives Matters, we believe in science little signs on their front yard who was quiet. I think it was largely the people who live in And it was maybe Hispanic working class people along the border, et cetera. So what does that tell us? They might live in fairly conservative places, but still be afraid to express their opinion. This has to do with the centralization and the nationalization of our attention. Trump was a result of this. Trump has caused it. The mainstream media has caused it. You see a homogenization of culture. We're less likely to have sort of a lot of local cultures and more likely to have a big one. And this isn't some big, fun, diverse melting pot. It's one where everybody's sort of afraid of and terrified of the other person and always convinced that their side is losing. So that's, I think, the background force behind it, Josh.
Terrific. So just to name this for all of us, basically we're going to go 15 minutes right now and then turn to you for questions that can sort of unpack more about what Christine, what Tim, and what Ben are saying. So what about along the same lines, maybe populism? And Ben, feel free to weigh in on that as well. Christine, as well, it's sort of on this answer. But populism's been at least part of it. Josh Hawley tweeted out on election night, "We're all working class now. We're essentially the party of the working class now." Ben, I think you had the line one time that of the 5 most powerful American public officials right now, 4 out of 5 are from either New York or from California. Schumer and Pelosi and McCarthy and certainly the president. So it's just McConnell who isn't. So what about the sort of elites versus heartland dynamic? Help us understand how populism, if it didn't elect Donald Trump this time, is still playing out in American life.
Well, I do think that this is going to have some difficult ramifications for the Republican leadership. In addition to Hawley, who's obviously been telegraphing his heartland populism approach as a preface to a 2024 run in all likelihood. You also saw Marco Rubio coming out and saying that he believed that the future of the Republican Party was more working class, more skeptical of free trade. This is going to have some real ramifications, and I think you're going to see a lot of politicians who attempt to both posture on this and others who try to do something from a policy perspective to solve this issue. To follow up a little bit on what Tim was saying, I do think that there is some early research that we're going to see dug into more. I've seen some behind the scenes, and then there's been some that's been shared publicly about the people who are most uncomfortable sharing their views. I think what you might end up discovering is that they end up occupying a lot more blue states, or states that they feel that are blue, and then also in districts where they feel like they overlap with different friend groups and different community folks who disagree with them. And that's why you saw Republicans prevail as they did in these California seats and in New York seats, et cetera. When it comes to the elite versus populist kind of thing, there's going to be a lot of new Republican members, and particularly in a House that is as closely divided as Nancy Pelosi has ever had as Speaker. That's going to have some ramifications on the floor, particularly given the arrival of so many Justice Democrats as well, who have their own priorities. You could see a sort of a similar thing that's happened to the experience of the Freedom Caucus on the Republican side, where with the ability of 10 to 15 members from the Democratic Party having different shared populist priorities, including people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others who are within that Justice Democrat group, they may end up joining with Republicans on certain things that they may not like about an agenda that could be too corporatist for their flavor. I don't know yet what that's going to look like. I do think that it's going to be interesting to see how many of these younger, newer members approach Washington. I look at someone like Maria Elvira Salazar, who beat Donna Shalala in Florida. She's an ex-Univision and Telemundo personality who nearly won 2 years ago. She had a distinct advantage in that race because Shalala does not speak Spanish, and she does. She's a Cuban immigrant and from a family that fled. That's the kind of person who could come into Washington and have an outsized role in the Republican side in the way that we saw some of these squad members have outside roles last time around.
Yeah, so I would jump in there and say, I think I agree with you in general. I would note that It could also simply be that, the most powerful elected leaders are from the coast because the largest segments of our population right now live on the coast, and urbanization is continuing to happen in the United States. That said, I think that on both sides, in both parties, you're beginning to see a realization that in moments of crisis, specifically in moments of crisis like the one that we're in now, you are going to see voters be more interested in material concerns. They want policies that produce material advantage in changing conditions for themselves and their families. So, one of the things that I would actually be hopeful and perhaps even excited for in a Democratic administration or a Biden administration is maybe a turn away from some of these questions of what some call identity politics, whether it's extreme slogans like defunding the police or debates about which pronouns to use on Twitter, these sort of almost academic grad school concerns. Um, and a focus on policies that will change the lives of, yes, the working class, the middle class. I mean, if you look at the votes in Florida, for instance, you'll notice that that was a tight and surprising race for pollsters. Donald Trump did win, Joe Biden came second, but there were more votes for a $15 minimum wage, in fact, than there were votes for Joe Biden. People are interested in things that actually affect their lives and well-being, especially as the pandemic has brought questions about, family leave, childcare, healthcare, a social safety net to the forefront of people's minds. And we can hope, and I think we should press to have an administration and a Congress that in the next 4 years pays more attention to that than infighting or spreading culture war mistruths, which is unfortunately what the Trump administration did spend a lot of time doing.
Well, Josh, I just want to jump in and say I share Christine's hope and think it's possible, but the sort of cold water on that hope is that there's lots of things that are going to interfere with that effort to simply help people, and it's going to include the culture war stuff. You talk about helping families. Well, my idea of helping families, if I get on board and say I don't mind the government spending a little more money, giving people money, but if you just give it to families, no, a lot of people are saying, no, we should specifically be subsidizing childcare. And you get this argument both from a right that wants more women in the workplace to drive up GDP, and from a left, which, if I'm going to be cynical, they want, while they're trying to unionize childcare, they're trying to make a new sort of voter base. They sort of, some of them ideologically think that women's liberation requires getting more women out of the house and into working. So bam, right there, we're in a culture war. We've got sort of old school Republican ideas getting in the way of exactly this. If we're going to help people, and the populists are going to say, we're done with this laissez-faire Republicanism, we're going to start spending money to help people. What if somebody helping people is a church group? Are you really going to expect America? You really going to expect the left to be okay with federal money flowing more to church groups? Heck, was it in Missouri they tried to keep the Lutherans from getting mulch? You can't give government mulch to a Lutheran church because that would be breaking the wall of separation between church and state. I think the culture war is really, really deeply seated, much more than it ever has. And it's going to get in the way of, even if both parties agree, let's get the government helping people.
That's good. I hope we can get into a little bit of sort of the biases that exist with sort of elites and even journalism world versus religion as we unpack this a little bit more. But just to not miss the sort of top line pieces of the election, one major takeaway, right, is voter turnout having been massively higher than before. I think we can't miss that. Went from 66 million votes for Hillary and 63 for President Trump in 2016, up to 76 million for Biden and 71 million for Trump this time. So, with sort of the decision, as it were, that unfolded, what is, if there's not a mandate, what is the sort of main takeaway? Did sort of independent people in the middle say, look, we had a wrecking ball last time, and for the purposes of COVID, we needed to have sort of a different team in place this time around? Why did the Senate stay red, assuming Georgia stays? Just sort of directionally, what do you see as a sort of consequential red versus blue next steps or divides as the Biden-Harris administration kicks in?
I think that personally, Josh, that depends a lot on what they prioritize in their behavior. In the current moment with the current makeup, let's assume for the sake of argument that Democrats are not able to sweep both Georgia Senate seats in this January 5th runoff, which will probably end up costing people about $250 million. The ultimate, I think, takeaway from that is going to be a situation where Washington is only going to do what it does best, which is spend people's money. And I think that that's really the likeliest situation to come out of the makeup of the Congress, which means that a lot of these other issues will have to be dealt with via executive orders and the like. The Republicans in the House in particular are as bullish as they could possibly be, having lost no members and gained so many when they were expected. Even Fox News the evening of the election said that Nancy Pelosi would be gaining seats as opposed to losing them, something that they still haven't retracted. And then one of those things that I think you take away from a reversal of fortune in that way is that people feel very bullish when they are looking at a midterm that's just 2 years away. That means that Republicans, I think, are going to be loath to give the White House any kind of victory on an area of policy other than, potentially throwing some money at the various problems that people have when it comes to what I believe to be significant lockdowns that are going to happen within the coming months to deal with COVID. I mean, when you look at the makeup of President-elect Biden's coronavirus advisory council, the overwhelming majority of the people on it, have been in favor of both mandates and lockdowns as an approach. And so that is going to, I think, lead to a lot of states reacting, Republican governors pushing back against these types of things, wanting to keep their economies open. And that's going to be its whole back and forth. So, to the extent that there's going to be some idea of unity, I hate to say it, I just don't think that that's going to happen. I think there's too much division in the country right now about nearly every aspect of American life, and except perhaps to Christine's point about a more populist attitude towards economics. I think you see that both in the Florida vote that she mentioned for a $15 minimum wage, but also I think you see it in the California vote when it came to the treatment of Uber and Lyft gig economy workers. I think that was viewed and was successfully argued for by those entities as being itself kind of a populist argument that people should be able to earn these incomes. They didn't want to have those jobs go out of the state. And that's something that I think is going to have its own evolution going forward. How can a lot of these Republicans who have been basically pro big business as opposed to pro free market adapt to this element? And how does an administration that frankly, it doesn't have a very clear economic agenda when it comes to addressing a lot of these populist solutions, how are they going to adapt to this moment in ways that can satisfy a Republican Senate and what Nancy Pelosi's coalition wants?
I wonder if I can just remind us all that you can feed questions in through the chat function, and we'll be compiling those and turning to those in just a few minutes. So if you've got one, or if this has opened a new lane or angle of thought, please weigh in. And maybe we can turn quickly, Christine, to a little bit about sort of the psychology underneath some of this, and Tim, to your Alienated America book on the sort of civil society front. For you guys, like sort of getting underneath the macro that Ben just described, Christine, are there particular insights that you're discovering from your own research in the book at a time of some significant political importance in the country's life and a major sort of energy round and now recounts and the like that are a factor here, sort of the age of Me Too and pushback and dynamics around being, having machismo in play. Are there sort of key takeaways that you would sort of add to the mix? And then Tim, too, on your book, what's the state of civil society today? I mean, you spent a lot of pages talking about it. You traveled all over the place, but underneath of levers pulled election-wise, are you seeing things to be largely hollowed out? largely dynamic? Sort of how's that look? I know you compare different places in the book, but what's a snapshot of sort of country overall?
Christine first.
Yeah, that's a lot of different questions. But maybe I'll go back to front. To your question about machismo and how that played out in the election, I think that one of the things that pollsters and observers have been discussing most recently is how, rather surprisingly, Donald Trump actually rose in the esteem of Black and Hispanic men this time around. His share of their vote actually increased, not a huge amount, but any amount is huge for those groups for a Republican candidate. And there is a theory that I do think is true, that Donald Trump, part of his success in the United States in this campaign and with those groups is that he does portray what could almost be described as a traditional and sort of almost old school American individualist, macho sensibility. He portrays himself as a big business leader. He's not afraid, to say what he thinks. He does what he wants. And he has built a reputation on that, true or not. And I actually think that that might have been what did attract voters from those groups to him. But I'm not sure that that will actually be replicable going forward if the Republican Party is trying to attract that segment of the population again. Donald Trump is a fairly singular figure. And so I don't know that that should be counted upon going forward. But also, speaking of individualism, one of the things that I have found and noticed as I'm researching this book about sexual ethics, which is somewhat divided from the question of the election right now, is just an undercurrent of American thinking that actually touches almost every parts of our lives. And that is this idea of, sort of individualism, of, almost me first thinking of, I alone, decide my life and I am the most important person in my decision making and I need to think of myself first. And that is something that this presidency has embodied and, something that has, drawn some voters to him because he's seen as an example of that. But we also have seen that this has a really corrosive effect on our country and on our common good. If everybody is only looking out for number one, then no one is ever looking out for anyone else. If we all decide that we will only believe the things that we want to believe, or only support the truth that benefits us, that can in fact mean that we are, not choosing to believe in the truth at all, not engaging with the reality of our circumstances or that of other people. And I think that segment, that force of the sort of American personality has become far more evident over, the past 4 years, and in fact may have been a deciding, factor in some of the voting in this election. Where people did look at questions like, well, who might handle the coronavirus pandemic better? Whose policies might, help the greatest number of Americans as opposed to, just those in a certain income strata or those of a certain race, et cetera, and said, well, it might be the other guy, but I'm going to vote for what feels right for me. Like I want to care, about my segment and no one else's. And that is not a good way for a country to function going forward. This sort of solipsistic view of the world. It hurts our ability to understand the facts on the ground and to come together. So here's hoping that we could see some change going forward. But again, I'm not sure.
I think everything Christine just said is true and very important. I mean, it's a perversion of individualism. Solipsism is a fine word, and the word I used in my book was alienation, and that was a huge part of it, that people feel betrayed by institutions, and some of it is rightly so. I mean, we had the Iraq War, then we had a financial crisis in which people who sort of played by the rules lost lots of money, and the big rich fat cats in Wall Street who failed somehow were bailed out. I'm a Catholic. Our church betrayed us in the most unspeakable, vile way when the hierarchy covered up a rape scandal among the clergy, and it wasn't just a Catholic church, it was public schools, it was evangelical denominations, it was our universities, that a lot of people who looked around and said, okay, I thought that these institutions were looking out for me. They're not. Now, where are people not alienated? It's people who still belong to these strong communities, probably everybody on this call. If you go to church every Sunday, if you live in an upper middle class community, you probably feel there still are institutions that you can trust. And that is what lifts you out of your solipsism, your hyper individualism. I always tell the story of how I got roped into coaching my daughter Meg's basketball team. Meg was in kindergarten at the time. It was because somebody basically cornered me in the foyer outside of church after mass one day, that these belonging to things, trusting in institutions, investing ourselves in them, that's what brings us out of just looking at ourselves. So the alienation is Robert Putnam's bowling alone. Increasingly, Americans don't belong to things. And so to more directly answer your question, Josh, it hasn't turned around in 4 years. I think Trump was elected by people who, his earliest support in the earliest primaries, I do an analysis of Iowa, of the counties across the country where he did best in the earliest primaries. Those were the counties where Trump was beating Cruz and Rubio, et cetera. Those were the counties with the least church attendance. Those were the counties with the fewest sort of bowling leagues. And it wasn't sort of saying Trump's going to restore my church or restore my bowling league. It's, I don't have that strong community. Trump sees that Americans is broken and maybe Trump can restore it. No, the federal government was never going to restore your, your rosary meeting, your bowling league, your Knights of Columbus, or your PTA. It hasn't really gotten better. It still might be fine in certain circles that we are blessed to belong to, but I don't think it's improving. The coronavirus and the lockdown sure aren't helping.
So
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just to jump in very quickly. Actually, I think that this lack of institutions is also a key part of some of the changes that we're seeing in our political landscape, specifically the increasing sort of virulence and all-encompassing nature of our politics. One of the things that we've seen increasing in truth over the past 4 years is that people are getting really emotionally involved in their politics. We're not just necessarily voting for policy proposals. It's this person represents me. This person is my way of life. It's not that I'm for Trump's policies. I am just a Trump lover. That's my identity. And so I have to, go to these marches, threaten to kidnap a governor, do all sorts of things that seem very intense. And I do think that, to Tim's point, part of this is because people are losing these connections to actual real institutions. If they don't have a church community, if they're no longer close to their family, if they don't have a bowling league, humans are social. Humans want to belong to things. People want to belong to something larger than themselves. And when all of the real and healthy institutions seem to be falling away, what's left is politics, and people, join up with a political position or a political team as though that's their church and that's their gospel. And in fact, they invest so much of themselves in that it can become very unhealthy. And it also doesn't then allow for the sort of give and take that makes a democracy possible. If your identity is wrapped up in a specific form of, populist republicanism, say, then, or your identity is wrapped up in the fact that, say, you don't believe that athletes should kneel in protest of racial injustice, it's going to be very hard for you to listen to somebody who disagrees, to compromise on any issues, to see the other side, because that has become a religious tenet. And I think
Christine,
that's what has made it so furious.
Yeah. I'm tracking right with what you're saying, and I think it it dovetails nicely with where a lot of people in the gathering are coming from in terms of building up civil society, working local, being practical, not putting all their identity in national politics, and the sort of sad hollowing out that exists when you do, when things get depleted at the local level. So there's one question that's come in that I want to put maybe to Ben in particular. From one of our participants today. There are a few others as well, so please keep them coming, guys, because we want to turn to that. because it always is more interesting when we get to do that. But specifically, a gathering guest, faith angle friend in Oregon and Washington State said essentially that, it seems like some journalists tend to assume that if people voted for Trump, it's because they support Trump and like his style. But could it be that in the last couple of elections, a substantial number of people were voting against Hillary or against Biden even? And could it be that there's some faith in having a check and balance in the government? What are your thoughts on that sort of that vote cast?
Not only is that instinct correct, it's borne out in the data. I mean, we have enormous evidence that there's huge portions of support among the president's base that disliked his manner but agreed with his aims, or believed that he was a hedge, a bulwark against what they viewed as being a real threat to their way of life. That's something that our own reporters, we have a crew of 14, and they went to 28 states this cycle in terms of covering things on the ground, interviewing people there. And it's something that they routinely would hear from the president's own supporters. So I think that that's definitely something that is true. Just to respond quickly to what Tim and Christine were saying, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I do believe that one aspect that we haven't talked about here looms outsized in terms of being a crusher of institutions, and that's big tech. America's most successful Silicon Valley companies have reached a point where they provide all the things, or pretend to provide all the things, that you would need in life to stay home during this pandemic, to have people, faceless people delivering brown boxes to you in ways that historically people would have. If we had a child in a normal time, we would have had the opportunity to introduce her to dozens, if not hundreds of people by now. They would be bringing us meals. Instead, it has to be this whole convoluted process, and you end up ordering things instead. That's what Silicon Valley wants and is built for. It's the Father John Misty line about betting Taylor Swift every night in the Oculus Rift. It's that completely separated existence where everything that you do is via VR, it's streamed, it's ordered, it's faceless, it's personless, it has no community or neighborhood element to it. And that, to me, is something that I think is going to be incredibly difficult to overcome in the immediate because of all of these different things that have happened, but also in the long term, because I think this is going to have such an outsized effect on society that people are going to start living very differently. They clearly are already moving with their feet away from cities in a way that has driven up real estate costs and had its own impact. And it just is going to be something that I think is much bigger even than who people are voting for.
Can you guys reflect on that just a little bit before we go to Joe Cook, who has a question in waiting? So Joe, you'll be up first to kick us off. But what about what Ben just said about the power and significance of the sort of tech transformation that we've all been wrestling with this year as it played out in the election? And linked to it, I suppose, the religion question that we talked briefly about earlier. Berger had that line in '96 that we're a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes. That we're mostly a religious people, and we're mostly ruled by people who are, like in Sweden, not religious. Maybe we're less religious today than we were even 25 years ago, but we're still pretty religious, and a lot of commentary is bearing that out. In fact, Michael yesterday said if it weren't for white evangelicals in Georgia and Michigan and Pennsylvania and a couple other places, the election might have gone a different way. So there's something maybe at least to consider there. How do you grade your peer journalists on their understanding religion in the country, and maybe from it, the right place of technology?
Well, I'll jump in first, just to say the most important thing about religion, if you're a sociologist, is attendance. This is what, I don't know if you guys read Bowling Alone, but he had one chapter on religion that said, oh, and by the way, 50% of all civic activity originates in church-based groups. And my reaction was, shouldn't religion get more than one chapter, right? And so then he actually, Robert Putnam wrote a follow-up with David Campbell, a Mormon who's at Notre Dame, all about this, American Grace. And what they found was religious people more likely to donate, religious people more likely to volunteer, even for secular causes. People see their religious neighbors as more trustworthy, and religious people trust other people more. But none of this had to do with frequency of prayer or depth of belief or how good your homilist was on Sunday telling you to love your neighbor. All of the effect came from attendance. That is to say, nothing replaces in-person, face-to-face contact with other people who are engaged in the same sort of joint undertaking for a higher cause. So this is why the pandemic is crushing. This is why churches that might want to say, oh, we'll make it easier for you and not meet in person, you can always come virtually, might be making a grave mistake. I don't know, maybe we're kind of face-to-face here. I'm sure this is better than just listening on the radio or just a one-way YouTube or something, but still, that for me is a key thing. And in the findings I found in my book, that was again what I found, that if you wanted to predict somebody's sense of alienation, the likelihood they would get married, the likelihood they would stay married, the likelihood that a child be raised by their parents, it was the attendance of church was the main religious determinant there. And that is a huge part of what's being lost. People who say, if you're, and I'm a Catholic, so I'm biased here, but if your spirituality is, it's my own personal relationship with Jesus, I don't need this institution. Well, you still need to get together with other people to get the sociological benefits of church.
Yeah, I'll jump in there and say that I think that what Ben said about tech being a kind of killer of community is actually exactly right. And I agree, that's definitely going to be one of the bigger challenges facing us in the next decade, in the next years to come. Because, you know, as you said, these social media companies just living on Facebook or Instagram and Twitter, they do allow you to create your own world where you have your own facts, where you can be surrounded by people who share your own opinions. So you live in an echo chamber. When you talk about, you know, tech, even delivery apps, yes, you are literally in your own house and nobody need enter except the faceless person who delivers your Amazon package or your Uber Eats or picks you up in a car but doesn't talk to you. And that is actually terrifying if you think of, you know, how we do build bonds with our communities, not just our families or friends, but the people who we see every day, our neighbors, those who live down the street, who we should, in fact, still be responsible for in any understanding of the common good. The problem, of course, is that these tech companies are also extremely savvy. You know, they know that people are thinking this way, at least slightly. So there's always a new update or a new device or a new sort of innovation that allows them to make themselves even more a part of our lives. It becomes very difficult to abstract yourself or remove yourself from this sort of tech monopoly that we have in our everyday lives. So I think we just as individuals need to be aware of how much time, how much energy, how many resources we give to our devices and these false communities. And then to Tim's point about church attendance, that's actually one of the interesting things that we have seen in this election, and something that as we get more exit polling and more, you know, truthful polling about what happened this year may bear out. There does seem to be a distinction, you know, in the United States now that's increasingly growing wider between, you know, Christians who attend church, who are part of their faith communities, who you know, actively involve their faith in their everyday lives, and what some pollsters have taken to calling cultural Christians, those who, you know, say that they're Christian but maybe like only go to church once or twice a year, if that, and their Christianity is more actually about sort of associations to different cultural trappings, not actually about the faith, about the Bible, about being a witness. And you know, the votes there are kind of diverging in interesting ways, and also the numbers there are shifting. You're seeing a lot more of these cultural Christians, but also a lot more people who are not identified with any faith tradition at all, nuns, and they actually vote in diametrically opposed ways.
And I just
So
quickly add
huge.
there, Christine, that it was really the genius of the gathering to choose to schedule this sort of before we knew how things would play. And we are in this time of still trying to decipher, available polling data, not just exit polls, but a lot of other information. And so there is a lot of learning that is still sort of unfolding in real time and still ahead. And I want to get to Joe Cook, but please finish out your thought. Unless, how about that, Christina? Can we go to Joe?
Yeah, go for it.
So first of all, thanks again to the gathering I think this is an important component of what our new life is going to have to be, and that's intentionally finding ways of reaching out and making connections. Even when we don't agree, for goodness sake, we need to restart some conversations around just general themes. And so my question centers around what I perceive to be, and the people that I've talked to, some of whom are willing to share with me who they voted for and some didn't, but almost in general, I find a sense of fatigue of the animus and the negative note and the character assassination. And I was thinking today about poor old Dan Quayle when he misspelled potato, and it became a cause celeb for weeks about, how could we have a vice president that can't spell potato or whatever it was, I don't know. And so my conversations have centered around, well, okay, let's acknowledge those exist, but are there some things we can imagine that we could agree on? Let's get started on something that shows we can actually do some things together. And I'm a big fan of Mitch Daniels. I think Mitch is a rational person that thinks about a lot of things, and he has written much about perhaps there's a time where you have to simply park some of the social agenda issues on the side and work towards some common good in the middle to strengthen the core of who we are. So my question goes to the idea, is it possible that we could see a agreement on something like a increase in the minimum wage, on infrastructure projects, and on a number of things that actually would change the tone to something that's more like working without necessarily bringing all the conflict immediately into every decision? Is that even possible to hope and wish for?
I'm going to reiterate. Thank you, Joe, for your question. I think there's real culture war problems. This is what I thought about when people said, let's have a, a jobs guarantee was one of sort of the ideas coming out of, an Occupy Wall Street, AOC, Bernie Sanders type world. And I thought, if that job guarantee included working as an escort outside of Planned Parenthood, it would not go over. If that jobs guarantee included working at a gun range, it would not go over very well. Now, maybe there's a lot of middle ground where we could agree. But again, I think churches have to be a central institution of civil society. They have to be a public institution. And so some of the ideas of let's, build out infrastructure, that kind of thing, run into that problem. And there's not a lot of middle ground, because either church is something that has to be kept a million miles away from government, or it's a central institution. I think on the local level is where you're a lot more likely to find common ground, because people are less likely to be ideological about something they can see. My neighbors and I agreed about changing a traffic signal, and it was literally like a Green Party person, a Trump person, me, and a Biden person. We're able to fully agree. There's no ideology involved in it. And thankfully, I mean, the good news is, I think the local level is where the important work has to happen. But on the national level, a lot is going to have to change. The temperature is going to take a long time to come down before I think on a meaningful level we can get together. Now, hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully a year from now, you guys can point to something big that happened. But I think the fever is too high.
I was happy to see Mitch. I think it was actually the last event that I did before things shut down. Was he hosted me at Purdue, and he's a wonderful man. So I share your appreciation of him. I also would say to not to have too much Chesterton in this, but the line that keep the politicians who matter close enough to kick. And I think that that's something that is very true about what Tim is saying there, which is it would be nicer to get down to local levels on a lot of these things. Unfortunately, I just don't think the temperature is going to go down. There's too many commitments that were made along the way for Joe Biden, I think, to get to this point, to go away from them. And I think the cabinet that he's going to end up with is going to be very active in doing a lot of things that are going to make a lot of right of center Catholics very upset, particularly when it comes to the Hyde Amendment and to abortion funding generally. At the same time, one thing that I would say about what you're saying there is that speaks to how much the danger of what Christine was talking about is very real. When you have this almost religious affiliation with your political side, and you are incapable of being able to even work with people along lines where working with someone on the other side is viewed with utter animus, as if you've betrayed the people who've supported you, that's something that's truly unhealthy. And I think it speaks to a lack of awareness of what we want to achieve in terms of moving the country forward and having some kind of unity. I admit that I am more pessimistic than others when it comes to that possibility at this current moment. But I'd like for things to go differently. I'd like for them to tone down and to tap down on a lot of these different culture war issues that should not be as central to our argument as they are.
Question that comes from Jeff. I'm going to get this right. Schwarzenbruger is about cancel culture and about the sort of fundamental clash between, let's just say, sort of conservatives in the heartland versus the rising sort of PC trends that exist today, and sort of that clash, that angle. Don't you think that some conservatives this time around were simply afraid to express their opinions because of their concern that cancel culture will compromise their own life? And maybe linked to that, picking up on what Ben had mentioned earlier about white shift, obviously, demographic destiny ideas are continue to be loud and with us and ascending in terms of demography is destiny, right? So, the book you mentioned, White Shift, talks about a decreasing percentage of white Americans in the country, sort of feelings of concern, alarm, fear that sometimes accompany that certainly have been accompanying that in places like Western Europe, where populism has really taken off. So, like if it went from maybe 70% of the voting share in 2016 for white Americans to 67% this time, and if for Hispanics it went from 11% of the voting share last time to 13% today, how do you see race sometimes alongside of religion playing into some of what you were describing earlier? Like Christine was mentioning, 2 in 10 black men voted for the president, and 1 in 10 black women voted for the president. So there's a machismo dynamic perhaps, but how do you see race playing into the sort of fears around cancel culture that Jeff has outlined? Softball.
Christine, do you want to go first?
Well, no, I was actually going to go second because I'm interested in hearing this address.
I think, look, I guess what I would say is my father's Puerto Rican. I'm routinely insulted by the way that Hispanics are lumped together. One of the things that Nicole Hannah-Jones actually got right in a tweet recently was talking about how the Hispanic Latino category inaccurately lumps people together in ways that it really shouldn't, because it's inaccurate. And I think that a lot of the assumptions that people have built in about the way that certain demographic groups are going to behave going forward has already been proven to just not be the case, that they have different priorities, often economic. I mean, something like defund the police doesn't work that well in Brownsville, Texas, when you have a police, operation that is overwhelmingly minority and Latino. And so this is one of these situations where I think the expectations that come out of Washington are often not borne out. On the cancel culture point, I just have to reiterate, I think that this Eakin study is one of the most important things to come out this year and really should be read by everybody, because it shows how deep-seated these issues really are. And even she will tell you, as she's told me, that they had difficulty getting a sufficient number of Trump supporters to respond to even that poll, which is designed to, again, illustrate the degree to which cancel culture has gone from being something that was talked about within the academy or on op-ed pages and the like, to being something that normal people are concerned about. That basically, if they, as a small business owner or as someone within their community, expresses the wrong view on social media, that they could end up getting just, blasted with reviews, highlighted in ways that really make their lives terrible, at least for a certain amount of time. That's something that I think has become a much more widespread issue than people really realized.
Christine, you
I'll throw in and give Christine more
please.
fodder very quickly. It's not just express the wrong views. It's use the wrong words. That the working class guy is worried that there is a new vocabulary out there that they don't know. And I'm not talking about like the N word. I'm talking about just the wrong vocabulary, the new rules about how you talk about race. And frankly, what seems to them a new definition of racism. If you're a 50-year-old guy, you thought racism was refusing to hire somebody because they're Black, or you thought racism was calling somebody a racial slur. And now you realize racism is this systemic thing that requires me to hate my own whiteness or something. And so there is no shared definition of the word racism. And that makes it utterly impossible for us to talk about unless you're very well versed in sort of the latest scholarship and discussion of it. You gave me a skeptical look, Christine.
Yeah, so I think I want to push back on that characterization of the question, the word racism, for instance. I think that one of the interesting and odd things about this idea of cancel culture that we're still sussing out is how much it does, in fact, affect the everyday person. And I do feel that there has been, unfortunately, in part due to sort of this almost religionizing of politics and political questions, a weaponization of certain fears. And I think that cancel culture as a fear, the idea that cancel culture is looming and it will like get you anytime and you can't say anything anymore in America, and we're all being held back. I think that has been weaponized in various forms of media to an extent that actually, overshadows where and how it actually exists. I mean, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. I live in DC now. I have, friends who live in rural areas. I also have friends who are, academics at liberal colleges. I think that especially in certain, academic circles and perhaps even elite media circles, the threat of cancel culture or the threat of being canceled does exist. But actually, I think if I go home, to Richmond, if I, speak to my, white godparents in Alabama, like there is a general understanding that like people are people. Most people actually don't exist on Twitter. Most people do not actually exist in the academy. And if, your neighbor says like something that's a little bit off, they're your neighbor and like, it's probably fine. And I'm often surprised by, the number of people who I talk to and reporting, et cetera, who are like, oh, like, did I say this wrong? You're going to cancel me. And I'm like, no, like I actually, I have no interest in doing that. That's not my main concern. And most of the people I know, I think that also isn't their main concern. I think you may be scaring yourself a little bit with this looming threat. Like the question of racism, as you said, Tim, defining it as like, oh, like it's suddenly like this systemic thing and like white people have to hate themselves. And like, no, like that is a weaponization of the way that, systemic racism is discussed. But actually, no one says that. Like, I don't know anyone who would define racism in that way. But that said, I also do think that it is, perhaps helpful and good for society if people realize that there are ways that you can be harmful to another person that are more subtle than, putting on a KKK hood. There are gradients, and perhaps we were beginning to realize how that functions in the real world. I think that's actually a good thing.
But Christine,
although it may be scary.
But Christine, aren't those two different definitions right there? Just in the sense that one of those aspects seems to be broad, systemic, require no action on the part of the person, and just be part of this holistic racist history of the country. Or on the other side, the traditional definition that I think most Americans had, which is that it's an individual act. It's something that is a choice and that reflects internal bias or negativity toward another person based on their racial background, especially requiring intent. That's something that used to be adjudicated a lot about whether it was something that was said intentionally or not, as opposed to just being part of a whole. And when something like the 1619 Project happens and people feel like that's going to be something that is going to be taught to their children, that's something I hear from our moms who have kids in school all the time, that they feel like they're coming home with lots of things that make them question whether they, little children who haven't done from their perspective anything wrong, are fundamentally a racist without even having participated in an act.
Yeah, sorry, John.
Yeah, I just was going to keep us marching forward, because I think there are so many cross currents, right, that are part of the pandemic, the election, the energy on both sides, the reality of tech revolution, that are sort of playing in, and the racial justice struggles of the year and challenges. I think a couple of questions that we have, from guests may continue to advance us, including one from Danny Rordance, who has a question, I think maybe tied to some of the things the AND campaign has been working on in this regard, because I think ultimately this is getting us to, as he's being brought up, to sort of the Christian response. Where do we go from here type of a response, whether we lean left or lean right. But Daniel, would you weigh in with your question here, please?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Good to see you guys. Thanks for hosting this today, everybody, and for being a part of this. I'm learning a lot, so I appreciate it. Yeah, one question I had was Justin Givney at the AND campaign. He often says that your vote is not the whole of your public witness, and even not the whole of your civic duty. And just a question specifically related to this last election. Many of us probably landed on different sides, but how can we, as people of faith who are uniquely focused on philanthropy, giving, generosity, what are some practical steps that we can take to kind of get our hands dirty, to get in the game on the other side of this? I loved the conversation earlier about collaboration together, but what are some practical steps that we can maybe start taking together as a community in the gathering, or just in our circles that we find ourselves in daily to take the right next step now on the other side of this?
I'll jump in quickly. Just where I live in the DC area, it's interesting. My parish is incredibly diverse racially, economically, everything. I mean, we have Republican lobbyists in their luxury cars, and we have kids getting dropped off in a taxi cab because their dad is a taxi driver who immigrated from Eritrea. My wife learned about Eritrea existing. That didn't exist when we were a kid, because we have like every country in Africa represented in our parish. When our kids get older, we send them off to single sex schools that are mostly white and wealthy. And we're like, we're the poor people in these schools. And so our kids get a very clear education in privilege. I could use all the liberal terms to talk about it, of white privilege, of systemic racism. Why do Hispanics in Montgomery County have to ride the bus while almost every white person has a car? And so this upfront education in this, that then we try to drive further home by getting more involved, both in our parish and outside with the Spanish-speaking community, running a T-ball program that deliberately reaches out to people who can't afford a meal and feeds everybody free burgers, just throw money in the basket, soup kitchen, volunteering, that sort of thing that we're doing without a lot of money on the parish level. Think, okay, yeah, let's give our kids a good education without the weird 1619 or whatever they're talking about in academia, but just drives it home. Okay, you have this privilege, and connecting people across. And the final thing I would say, this is not that well thought out. I'm a critic more than a solutions guy. But the final thing I would say is the chief thing holding back, preventing upward mobility, whether you're talking about poor whites in Appalachia, immigrants, African-American, multi-generational poverty, is a lack of connection. And not just a lack of connection to wealth and power, lack of connection to each other, but yeah, largely a lack of connection to wealth and power. Increasingly, we're segregated on basis of education and income. And so that's what I would focus on, connecting people. When Pope Francis talks about the poor, he talks about the inclusion of the poor. So that means making sure that there's like, this is impossible during coronavirus, but meals shared on a regular basis across classes and races, and that would be immensely valuable.
So one of the things that I think we're seeing a lot that has become increasingly notable as the pandemic has continued onwards, and as unfortunately economic support from the government has been turned off, it's just an incredible amount of visible and simple need in our communities, in our country. And if you think about, what Christian philanthropy could be, I mean, you can think of like the very obvious and basic commandments from the Bible, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, care for the sick. And I think that one of the things that could be very helpful and perhaps even crucial, at this time is simply getting money out the door to do those things. And perhaps being, or thinking of being, slightly less demanding in terms of, what does this look like? Like, do I have to shape this perfectly according to my specifications, knowing that that will take another, 6 months or 2 years to actually have something happen? Instead, perhaps we should be thinking of what can we do right now to help people right now who are actually desperate. And then I also think, we just talked a little bit to the side of questions of racism, structural and demographic change. I think over the past few years, eyes have been open to disparities in funding flows, and longstanding disadvantages and inequities in American society. And one thing that philanthropists might want to do, or at least think about, is how what they give and the organizations that they work with entrench or disentrench that equity. Like, is there a way to be working more with grassroots movements or working with groups that have been historically underfunded to promote equity, as well as, just giving money to favorite causes? Like, that might be something to think about going forward too. But I mean, the best thing is just to get involved like now when the need is there, and, I guess not necessarily be too demanding and, kind of sandy about where things go.
And there's a question. Oh yeah, we want to hear from you on Christian philanthropy in particular, but specifically the president of the Arthur Findings Davis Foundation, Michael just asked, what about local journalism as a piece of that larger equation? It seems to be drying up in a lot of places. As you think about building a team of 14 people who are doing this work together over time, a lot of us at the gathering talk about faithful presence, the James Davis and Hunter thesis about sort of working in the same institution for a long period of time, for a couple of decades. As you think about building a team at a newspaper, what about local journalism, and how does the world get better on these fronts with respect to Christian philanthropy?
Well, just quickly to the previous question, right now, Mark Cuban and John Legend are arguing because Cuban said that instead of giving to the Georgia Senate runoffs, you should give to your local food bank or shelter. And John Legend says that that's wrong, and that instead that charity doesn't work. So this is the kind of argument that I think we really are going to see play out going forward, which is a split between people who want to try to restore institutions or community organizations from a private side, and those who believe that only through government can we achieve the kind of fundamental change that they believe needs to happen. On the local journalism front, it's, again, this gets back to big tech. It's totally hollowed out. I mean, it's ridiculous. The number of resumes that I have, from people who are highly qualified local journalists who've been laid off after, decades of work in a community is just amazing. And there's really nothing for them to turn to. They're getting out of the industry. The level of support that exists for them is not there. And unfortunately, even on the national level, we're seeing the kind of departure from a willingness to cover some of these intense and very important events that happen in American life that really are not getting the level of coverage that they ought to. I'll just use Kenosha, Wisconsin as an example. We had a reporter on the ground in Kenosha the night of the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting. There were also reporters there from the Daily Caller and from Town Hall and internet sort of freelance journalists who were there. That's why we have the footage that exists from that incident. At the same time, the next week, or just a few days later, I should say, the New York Times reporter who was there went on to the Daily to explain why she left, because she didn't feel like it was going to be worthwhile for her to be there and that she was scared about things going sideways. That's something that we see happen all too often these days, which is that a lot of the journalism that we have that takes over the airwaves and can dominate coverage is coming from people who are kind of, have their own ideological frame of things, whether it be from the right or from the left, because those are the people who are willing to go to those places, willing to go to Portland to cover what's going on there, willing to go into these communities and to get the kind of coverage that's there. And it's no longer any kind of trusted local institution. And you have a lot of websites, frankly, that have cropped up that pretend to be local, but are in reality just kind of culling things from social media and the like in order to get clicks. It's a real problem. I don't have an easy solution to it. I think that's a longer conversation than can be had in the small amount of time we have left.
Well, let me turn things back over to Josh Kwan, the president of the Gathering, with great thanks that we had a little time to sort of dive into the tech institutionally changing reality of journalism today. And that's obviously the setting that Faith Angle is working with. Josh, one of the last questions that was raised was about where do we go from here, whether you lean old or new religious right, or whether you are part of the Christian left. What signals should each cohort be taking from this election? Obviously, that's work for each of us to discern prayerfully and carefully as we lean into the sort of transition ahead. But thank you, Josh, for teaming up and inviting Faith. I can be a part of it. And back over to you.
Sure. Well, I want to make sure we acknowledge virtually here our gratitude and our thanks to Christine, to Tim, to Ben for sharing your afternoon with us, sharing your insights, and to do it in such a productive and civil manner. That's really appreciated. I felt like you were able to make your points, very different ones, but still be able to listen and engage. And I hope that's reflected in the culture of the gathering too. I'd like to say thank you to Josh Good for moderating this conversation. This is something I think we'd like to do more than just a once a year basis at our conference, to have this kind of input, to have dialogue, to have questions from the gathering community. So look forward in the coming months to have more opportunities to talk about different issues, issues in giving, the craft and science and art of philanthropy, as well as talking about some of the issues and topics that are more granular in the coming months ahead. One last thing is, for those of you who registered for this event, you received a quick survey question about a possibility of getting together a sustained conversation with a smaller group of gathering participants who might explore the question about democracy, our constitutional republic. How do we preserve and keep vibrant this form of government that we have, this American experiment? We've seen some trends where there's some erosion of the core elements that enable us to have a healthy and vibrant democracy. And how do we, as Christian philanthropists, engage to sustain and strengthen those elements? So if you're interested in that conversation, please let me know. You can reach me over email or my phone number. I want to say thank you to everyone here and have a wonderful rest of your week.